Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be going through Unit 2 of AP Comparative Government and Politics. We're actually going to start with 2.1, crazy, I know, and then we're going to go up into 2.9 or 2.10. I don't know when this actually ends, but we'll get through this entire unit. Excellent. So, resources. These are some important resources that you can use. We have guided notes for all of my units, all the lectures, and all the subtopics. We have practice tests, both multiple choice and free response, answer keys for those as well, and a key terms list with the list of key terms that you need to know. Because College Board may just ask you for a simple definition on the multiple choice, and they will ask you for it on the free response. That is guaranteed. So it's very good to have those key terms memorized and understood, and that's going to help us master these topics. I like this unit. I think this unit's pretty straightforward. It's pretty much all brand new stuff to students, so that might be a little bit of a challenge, but once you get it down, it's going to seem like common sense. And as always, I'm going to reinforce the course and exam description, which is a document provided by the College Board that outlines what you need to know in this course, what could be on the exam, and what cannot be on the exam. And they have practice problems, and they tell you what skills you need to have, how they can ask you questions on the AP exam. It's very, very good. Teachers often don't share this resource with their students, which I don't know why. It's very beneficial to you. So that's what I'm doing. I'm sharing it to you. All right, let's get started. So we're going to talk about different political institutions. So we're going to start with parliamentary systems. And you probably know the UK has a parliament. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So parliamentary systems combine the lawmaking, which is our legislator, and executive function. So it's fusing together the legislative and executive branches. And this allows the national legislator, the Congress essentially, it's a parliament, to select and remove the head of government and the cabinet, which are executive positions. We'll go over what these terms mean later on. So as we discussed, this is the United Kingdom. It's our only course country that is parliamentary. They have a prime minister who is the leader of the national government. They lead the executive and legislative branch because of the fused powers. The legislator's majority political party is the people who select a prime minister. The citizens do not elect a prime minister in the United Kingdom. They do not have elections like we do in the United States every 4 years for their prime minister. This is selected through their parliament. They do get to elect some of their parliamentary members in one of the houses. So that it shows representation in the prime minister, because the majority political party is going to be represented in the parliament, which will be represented by the prime minister. It's all coming together. Now, the cabinet includes cabinet members and the head of bureaucracy, and they help in enforcing and explaining executive policy and decisions. These leaders in the United Kingdom are chosen by the prime minister. This is the center of policy making in the country. And they have collective responsibility, which means that all members publicly support government decisions, even if they don't agree on them. So outside of the room where it happens, they're going to say, yeah, this is a policy that we need. Inside, they can bicker all back and forth all they want. And Parliament is not a one-house Congress. There's two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. You might have heard about this in the news, and we'll discuss what those are. Now let's talk about presidential systems, which is what the United States is. It has a cabinet that is mostly responsible to the elected executive, which is the president. The legislator can remove cabinet members through impeachment, and they can remove the president. There are separate fixed-term popular elections for the national legislature. So what this means is that the legislator and the executive are not fused like in a parliamentary system. Both systems have elections for their members. So the president has an election, and then people in the legislature, representatives, have their own elections. And they also have fixed term limits. So they're not ruling for life, essentially. And these elections are for the people to vote on. The top executive leader serves as both the head of state and head of government. In a parliamentary system, those roles are separate. Same thing in the next system we're talking about, a semi-presidential system. And in our course, that's Nigeria and Mexico. So the executive branch consists of the president, who is the head of state and the head of government, and is also the commander-in-chief, which is the head of military service. The legislator's job is to create laws, impose taxes, reject treaties, declare war, ratify diplomatic appointments, which is foreign country cooperation, essentially. So they have their own functions, and the executive branch has their own functions as well. And then they also have a judiciary. The parliamentary system does too, but the judiciary is more independent. And the role of this judiciary, and all judiciaries essentially, is to interpret laws. And in our presidential systems, they're both federal, at least in this course, they're both federal countries. So they have federal and state judicial systems. And they also have Supreme Courts. Let's talk about our final political institution, which is a semi-presidential system. So these have separate popular elections for the president and for the national legislature, just like our presidential system. But the president nominates a prime minister with approval of the legislator, so he can't just recommend and bring in his brother without the legislator's approval, and they'll serve as the head of government. So that means the president is the head of state, while the prime minister is the head of government. So how is this different from a presidential system? Well, they have a prime minister that serves as the head of government. The president is not head of government, but it's similar to a parliamentary system because there's a prime minister. They also have a cabinet. These are held accountable to both the president and the legislator, similar to a parliamentary system. The cabinet is responsible for elements of policymaking, executing monetary policy, property protections, crime, essentially like the other systems as well. And Russia is our semi-presidential system in this course. Now, you probably have noticed that I did not discuss Iran and China. That's because they don't really fit any of these systems that well. China, you can say it best fits a presidential system because they have a president, but that legislator is such a huge representation of communism. Same thing with the executive and judicial branches, so they're all kind of fused together. And we don't have a system in the course where all three of those branches are fused together. Now, in Russia, the prime minister, even though they are the head of government, have had very, very, very little power until Putin took position in 2008. And Putin wanted that power, so he basically gave himself the power. Now, in the United Kingdom, the prime minister has a lot of power. Let's talk about checks and balances, because I've already kind of discussed this, but let's go into the actual checks and balances slide. The parliamentary systems have fewer institutional obstacles to enact policies. The fusing of those two branches makes it very easy to pass laws because, for one, the prime minister is selected through the majority party. So they're going to have similar ideologies and beliefs and agendas. So when a bill is passed and supported by the legislator, chances are the prime minister is going to want to pass it as well. And since there's not a greater number of obstacles to go through, those laws can be passed pretty quickly and efficiently. So presidential systems, on the other hand, have divided branch powers. So the legislature, the executive, and the judicial are going to be pretty independent, have their own rules, and this can create more obstacles in passing policies. It can be more inefficient and more time-consuming. So let's talk about some parliamentary system checks and balances. So they can consider cabinet members, and they can refuse to pass executive proposed legislation. So if the prime minister proposes legislation, it's not just automatically going to get passed. In a presidential and semi-presidential system, they may have a presidential decree or executive orders. But in a parliamentary system, that doesn't exist. So the legislator can say, nope, not going to happen. Then there's also questioning time. What does this mean? So this means that the people of the country, essentially the United Kingdom, in this case, have scheduled times where they can question and interact with the prime minister, with legislators, and they can ask them about what's happening in government. They can question their actions and hold them accountable to what they're doing. It also brings in time for other beliefs and opposition to have a voice and speak and debate with members of government. They can challenge the majority party governance and policy making. It's actually a very interesting process, and you can actually go online and view past question times from the United Kingdom. So the House of Commons is the house that holds this regularly, and they question government policies, particularly governmental policies that are implemented by the executive bureaucracy. So this allows majority members to indicate representation of interests of their constituents, which are the districts. So essentially, people are agreeing with the policy. They can show that they're representing the people. And as I said earlier, it allows the opposing party, maybe it's a minority group, to verbally challenge the majority party governance and decision-making. Basically say, wait, you're doing that, but if you do that, we're just going to blow the entire country up. Did you think of that, huh? Yeah. Very interesting. There's also snap elections, which is not something you need to know that well, but I think it's pretty cool to include. So parliaments may impose time deadlines on calling new elections. So this was passed in 2011 with a fixed-term election system of the House of Commons, which means that every so often there will be an election for the House of Commons. And this checks the Prime Minister's power, because that means if a new majority party comes in to the legislature, that Prime Minister might be booted out. So the Prime Minister can also force all members to campaign for re-election within a 30-day period with a supermajority of support. And this has occurred in 2017 as an example. So the Prime Minister can call for a new election and snap. Within 30 days, a new election occurs with campaigning. And if the legislator is still represented that majority party, the Prime Minister stays. If not, the Prime Minister is most likely going to be booted out, because a party's not going to want a Prime Minister as a part of a separate party. That's essentially like the Democrats in the United States voting for a Republican president, even though you got 20 other Democratic nominees. That typically doesn't happen, ever. I mean, it has happened before. Reagan is a great example, but it just typically doesn't happen. All right, more checks and balances, because, this is the only thing we talk about in this class. Presidential and semi-presidential systems, we'll see them within their divided governmental branches. This is actually a lot more feasible for a checks and balance system, because the legislature, executive, and judiciary are more independent. So the legislature and executive branches can change or reject policy proposals. In 2016, for example, the Mexico president vetoed a package of anti-corruption bills, and they asked Congress to change a measure that would force people or firms receiving government funding to publicly disclose their assets. That's just an example of the president vetoing a piece of policy passed by the legislature. This also happened the same year in Nigeria's Senate. A little different. The Senate actually rejected a proposed budget from the executive, so the other way around. And because their reasoning was that it relied too heavily on borrowing from foreign countries and increasing their foreign economic dependency. And there's been a lot of processes within Nigeria, especially with them taking loans from international organizations, where they want to decrease that dependency on other countries and increase their domestic business. Now, Trevor Packer's kind of devious, because the AP exam, from what I've seen, doesn't really ask you to compare presidential and parliamentary systems. Not presidential, parliamentary system. So the AP exam typically doesn't ask you to compare the presidential and parliamentary systems with semi-presidential systems. So they may ask you about the semi-presidential systems, but they typically don't ask you to compare them with another system. But they can ask to compare presidential and parliamentary all day long. Oh my gosh, they love it so much. This unit is like 20 to 30% of your AP exam, so it's pretty important, and they have a lot of room to ask about this. So I'm awesome, because I've just provided a table of comparison for you, and we'll go through it real quickly. So roles of the parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential systems. So parliamentary systems have a prime minister. Presidential system has a president. There's also a legislator, but there's also a legislator in the other two systems. So I'm actually going to cross that out real quick, because they also have a legislator. And then the semi-presidential system has both a president and a prime minister. It's semi-presidential, but semi-prime minister. So elections. So in a parliamentary system, we have direct legislator elections. The legislator, the majority party, will appoint a prime minister. In the presidential systems, we have a direct election for the legislative and executive branches. The cabinet is, though, approved by Congress. In a parliamentary system, in the UK, for at least in this class, you have to know about the UK, the cabinet is selected by the prime minister, but it's members from the Congress. So you can kind of say Congress approves it, because it is Congress, but they don't really approve it. It is members of Congress selected by the prime minister that will make up the cabinet. And then in our semi-presidential system, they have direct presidential elections, and then the president appoints the cabinet and the prime minister. Separation of powers, there's very little separation of powers within a parliamentary system. Power lies within the legislator. And then our presidential system and in our semi-presidential system, we have a great deal of separation of powers in that checks and balances that we discussed. And then gridlock. Gridlock essentially means, is there a lot of obstacles to passing policy and getting things done? Since there's a fusing of powers in our parliamentary system, that typically doesn't happen. But in a presidential system, it can be pretty common. And then in a semi-presidential system, it's actually pretty low, because the prime minister can be kind of a medium and serve as a administrator role and find compromise. They can. Doesn't mean it always happens, though. I also have executives. So governments have executive institutions, including chief executives and cabinets, that formulate, implement, and enforce policy through different methods and agencies. So basically, they are the enforcers of your policy. Head of state. So this is a executive position. This is the highest representation of a state. It's very ceremonial, though. They're kind of the face of the country, and they may not be involved with the day-to-day political actions. If you ever watch a movie and a CEO's like, I have the boring job, they really do, because they're the face of the company. They have to do all the paperwork, and they're not really involved in the actual processes of their cool company. But they may have some informal powers over foreign policy, who they deal with. The head of government is the other main role that you have to know, and this is the executive leader, sometimes the chief executive, like a president, and they're responsible for formulating, implementing, and executing policies through a cabinet and or various government agencies, and they're the ones who are in the mud, involved in the day-to-day processes. They're getting their hands dirty in the politics. So let's look at China. China's president serves as commander-in-chief, the chair of China's military commission, so kind of similar, and they are the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. So they have a variety of roles. So the commander-in-chief, as we discussed earlier, is the top government official in charge of military decisions. The president nominates the premier of the Communist Party, so that's the role, premier, and they are the head of government. And they oversee the civil service and hold great legislative power. So if the premier is the head of government, who's the head of state? The president. So that head of government is going to be more involved. My phone just went off. More involved in the day-to-day processes, as we can see here with their greater legislative power. Now, changes in the top leadership. So who's the premier? Who's the president? That kind of happens with behind closed doors in the room where it happens. And people don't really have any elections or say in these matters. Top leaders of the Communist Party will determine the top governing of features from within the ranks of the party leaders without any input or care of the public whatsoever. They literally do not matter to the government. All right, let's talk about Iran for the first time in this whole unit. Iran's supreme leader sets the political agenda. They serve as the head of state, and they are the commander-in-chief. Typically, your head of state and commander-in-chief are going to go side by side. They appoint top ministers, the Expediency Council, the half of the Guardian Council, and the head of judiciary. Now, what are all these councils? What in the world are we talking about? Well, we'll get into this. But these are the rules that you just kind of have to write down in bullet points in the guided notes or whatever notes you're taking. And we'll go over what they mean. Let's start with the Guardian Council. So the Guardian Council has a role of vetoing power of legislation that's passed by the legislative branch, which is the Majlis, and essentially they will veto legislation that is not compliant with Islamic law. They also supervise elections for the president, and they will approve candidates to run in the Assembly of Experts elections. Now, the Assembly of Experts appoints the supreme leader. And then the Expediency Council is an advisory board for the supreme leader. They're kind of like their secretaries and settles disputes between the legislator and the Guardian Council over legislation. Because the legislator will be like, yeah. It's very, very, very Muslim law. And the Guardian Council will be like, no, this isn't Muslim at all. So they're kind of that compromise there. And they all kind of go side by side. Now, I have something kind of interesting to point out here. So the supreme leader appoints half of the Guardian Council, who approves candidates to run in the Assembly of Experts, who appoint the supreme leader. It's kind of interesting how that circle's forming here. Now, the supreme leader also appoints the head of the judiciary. The judiciary. They also appoint the other half of the Guardian Council, who appoints the Assembly of Experts, not appoints, but they approve of the Assembly of Experts, essentially, who appoint the supreme leader. Again, another circle kind of forming here. The president is elected for up to 2 4-year terms as the head of government. They oversee civil services and conduct foreign policy and do all the boring stuff that is very involved in the mud. I guess it's probably boring either way what role you have. The supreme leader is probably a more boring job because they're the head of state. But the president, it's going to be more, it's going to be more tiring because you're going to be, it's like going down to the basement in the mail room and doing the work there rather than just receiving your mail and sending emails saying thank you. All right, let's talk about Mexico. I love this gif from Bruce Almighty. Such a good movie. Mexico's elected president, because this is a presidential system, serves as both the head of state and head of government. They also serve as the commander-in-chief and the leader of the bureaucracy. And they can approve domestic legislation, which is just legislation within the country, and lead foreign policy. They are restricted to 1 term, which is 6 years. The president may elect cabinet members, but some positions may need approval of the Senate, not the Chamber of Deputies, which is the other house. Yeah. Nigeria. Nigeria's elected president is also the head of state, head of government. Remember, this is a presidential system. They serve as the chief executive, the commander-in-chief, overseeing the military. They also are the head of civil service, and they can approve domestic legislation and conduct foreign policy. So very, very similar to the Mexican system. The president will appoint members of the cabinet with the approval of the Senate. So we can see in both countries, the Senate has an interesting role here in approving certain members of the cabinet. Let's talk about Russia. So Russia's prime minister is the head of government, and they oversee the civil service, and they're nominated by the president. They're not elected by the people. The elected president is the head of state and commander-in-chief. Typically, those go side on side, like I said. They appoint the top ministers, appoint top judges, conduct foreign policy, and they preside over the Duma under certain conditions. Now, what is the Duma? The Duma is a house of the Russian Congress. And as I said in Unit 1, the Duma is primarily United Russia members. Now, same thing as the president and the prime minister. They are particularly United Russia. So they're going to get along pretty well. Now, Russia's president oversees the power ministries like the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service. So they got a lot of power. Now let's talk about the United Kingdom, because we haven't discussed it enough in this course. The United Kingdom's monarch serves as the head of state. They're the ceremonial person. They have that cool wave. I don't know if you ever noticed that before. If you watch Princess Diaries, they actually go over those royal waves that they have. That's essentially what the head of state is, because they're the face of the country. All the memes come from the head of state, because all the Charlie memes are hilarious. And I don't see any memes about the prime minister. And the UK formally appoints the prime minister, who is the leader of the party or coalition that holds the largest number of seats in the House of Commons. So the House of Commons is appointing the prime minister, but the monarch actually lays down the sword on their shoulders and brings them in. They really don't have any power. They used to, but they don't anymore because of legislative actions passed by the House of Commons. The prime minister is the head of government. They do all the dirty work. They can call elections, lead legislature and the cabinet. They set the foreign policy agenda, and they serve as a de facto commander-in-chief. So essentially, the UK's monarch is the commander-in-chief, but they aren't really the commander-in-chief. The prime minister does all that. They're also the chief executive over the civil service. Look how much fun Charlie has. That zip line looks pretty cool. All right, let's talk about term limits. And since I'm the best instructor on the internet, I made a table for you about our term limits for each of our executives in our 6 course countries and how they're established, because you also have to know that. So in China, the president can serve as long as they want. It used to be 10 years up until 2018, as the Constitution had that written in, but the president got that out of there. Okay, so Iran, the supreme leader is the head of state, and they serve for 10 years, and they're selected by the Assembly of Experts. And this is established through Iranian law. The president has term limits as well for 4 years a term, for 2 terms like the American president, also set by Iranian law. Now, our next 3 countries have a written constitution. The UK has an unwritten constitution, but they abide by certain constitutional principles. So Mexico has a single term limit that is for 6 years. It's called a sexennial. That prefix sex means 6. Nigeria has 4-year term limits for 2 terms, similar to Iran. And then in Russia, there's 6 years a term, but they can have 2 terms, and 2 terms in a row. Now, what does that mean, in a row? Well, that means that you could serve 2 terms, become prime minister, and then become president again, which is very interesting. And these are all established through Constitution. In the UK, there's no formal term limit, but when that majority party changes in Congress, that prime minister is going to change. So let's look at the pros of term limits, because there's some good sides and advantages to having executive term limits. And this is a great FRQ topic on the AP exam, on any of the FRQs. So Trevor Packer might be watching this video and thinking, oh yes, let's trick the students and put something on here about term limits, because apparently nobody cares about term limits. So I'm going to make you care about term limits. So term limits will check the executive power by inhibiting the emergence of dictators and personality rule. So a dictator's going to rise up and rule for the rest of their life. But if you only have 6 years to rule in Mexico, you're not going to become a dictator. You got to get stuff done, and quickly too. And it helps to focus the office holder on governing rather than winning elections. If they can only win one election and serve for one term, they're not going to focus on just winning elections over and over again and appealing to the politics and the bosses and the drug cartels and all of those other groups that have somewhat influential opinions and roles in politics. Because every country has that. We're actually going to focus on passing good legislative and having a good reputation. And if they can get booted out of office, they're going to do stuff that pleases the country. It also provides opportunities for new leaders with new ideas, backgrounds, policies, or goals. Let's say the interest of the country changes after 10 years because of some big event like a war. A new executive could represent the newfound interests of the people. Also bring in new ideas that people may have not thought of before, or compromises that haven't been offered yet. Now, there are some downsides to term limits. So the first one is it will force some good executives to leave offices. So people with good charisma may have to leave, even though people like their face too much. It also allows insufficient time for an office holder to achieve goals. Maybe there's a policy that they have to enact in stages, or there's not enough time for the legislator to approve or implement an action before someone else comes in and repeals it. They could also impede policy continuity. So if you have a new president every 4 years in Nigeria, they can implement new policies that counteract one another or contradict each other. It also create a lame duck period for the office holder. Now, what does that mean, a lame duck period? And that's essentially the period between an election when someone is voted in and wins the election before the time that they are brought into office. So in America, this is about 2 months from election day to early January. And this can range by country to country. And this can be created as a result of term limits because they have to bring in someone else and approve them and do all that fun stuff. It also prevents the office holder from building experience as a chief executive. So in America, you have 2 term limits. In Nigeria, same thing. You got 2 term limits for 4 years, and in Iran too. So they may build experience, maybe getting more comfortable or understanding how to conduct their role. They're not just learning how to do it and boom, boot it out. Let's bring in someone else. It also can cause poorly designed policy. They may feel rushed to implement and enact policy and change within the country. Now let's talk about the removal of the executives. In America, this is impeachment, and it's impeachment in other countries, but not all of them. So we're going to look at the forced removal of executives. They can resign, but we're not going to talk about that because who cares about that? So the removal of executives, the forced removal, can increase the public's trust in government by holding politicians accountable for their actions, and it shows that the legislator has a sense of checks and balances against the executive. And this is typically done in cases of serious misconduct by political leaders. So in Iran, the supreme leader can be removed by the Assembly of Experts, which is the same body that appoints them. There are 88 elected Islamic scholars. Now, this is an ill-defined process that hasn't happened for either supreme leader. There's only been 2 since the 70s when that role was implemented. But the president can be removed by the supreme leader or the legislator. Now, in Nigeria, the legislator can impeach the president through a vote of 2/3 of the representatives from both the lower and upper house of Congress, of both houses, have to vote 2/3 in support of impeachment. And this is in case of a enactment of gross misconduct. The vice president will then become the president. And then in Mexico, we also have impeachment. This is mentioned in the Constitution, but the process remains unclear, so we're not really going to talk about it. Now, in the United Kingdom, we have to talk about a confidence motion. So this is a vote in the legislature, but it's a vote of no confidence. They have no confidence in you. And the prime minister resigns, or a general election is called for the legislator. And if that legislator has a new majority party, that prime minister is booted out. So as I discussed, the legislator appoints the prime minister. So the prime minister can either resign or face the potential wrath of being booted out from a new legislator. Now in China, the National People's Congress can remove the president if they're not communist enough. Now in Russia, the legislator can impeach the president as laid out by the Constitution, like in Nigeria and Mexico. Well, Mexico, we don't really know how it works. But they signed a petition for impeachment by not 1/3 of the lower house, 2/3. That's not right. 2/3 of the lower house, which is the Duma, and it's sent to the upper house, which is the Federation Council, and then it's referred to the Constitutional Court, which is a body we haven't really discussed yet, and that's all you have to know. It's involved in the impeachment process. All right, so let's start talking about the legislative branches of our countries. So it starts with unicameral legislators, which means there are one chamber in the legislative branch. There's one house. Now, these are considered to be more simple and efficient because there's less obstacles for policy to have to go through to be passed. You have a smaller number of people that have to vote and approve of it. It's also considered cheaper. You have to hire less. You have to have less infrastructure for them to meet in. Hiring less means you pay less, so it is cheaper. It is also considered to be more accountable. There's a smaller body that's proposing and passing and agreeing with these laws and policies that's being passed in the country. If they're doing something that the people believe they shouldn't be doing, they're going to point fingers at this one simple body. And in our course, that's going to be Iran and China. They are our unicameral legislators. Now we have bicameral legislators, which have two chambers, two houses. And this has advantages in greater representation when you have more representatives representing the different viewpoints of the people within the country. We're going to have more people possibly possessing minority viewpoints. There's also going to be a system of checks and balances within the legislative branch themselves. One chamber could reject another chamber's proposed law, so they could vote on it, but majority say no, and that law won't be passed. It's also considered to be more stable and promotes political stability than a unicameral legislator. And Nigeria, the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Russia are considered bicameral legislators. Let's look at our countries individually, starting with China. So China's party control system consists of an elected National People's Congress. This is the NPC, and the Constitution creates this organization, and they recognize it as the government's most powerful institution. Now, is it? Not really. Members of the NPC serve term limits of 5 years. However, they're not elected by the peoples. The people don't go in and vote for legislators to represent them. No, they're not representing the people. They're representing the Communist Party. So they're indirectly elected through a series of regional communist legislative assemblies. So these assemblies are going to select the National People's Congress. The National People's Congress will then select the president. So again, the people in China are not electing their president. Their head of state is chosen by other members of the Communist Party. And then they will approve the premier. So the president will select the premier. The NPC will approve of this premier, and they'll serve as the head of government. And of course, they will legitimize policies of the executive, and there's not going to be really any problem with this because they're, for one, the only body that these policies have to be legitimized from, and they're already going to agree with them because communist China. Everything in that political system that gets anything done is part of a communist agenda. And because of this, they are a rubber stamp of executive policy decisions. Now, unlike most legislators throughout the world, the NPC only meets for 2 weeks each year. That's literally it. That's all they do. The Constitution claims it's the most powerful institution, but how can you be the most powerful institution if you meet for only 2 weeks? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't really live up to that name. And we'll also talk about why later on. Let's talk about Iran's legislator. So this is the Majles. They are elected by the people, not like in China, and they hold the power to approve legislation, oversee the budget, and confirm presidential nominees to the cabinet. So the president will pick people for the cabinet, and the legislator will approve them. So that's a system of checks and balances. This body acts under the system of the Guardian Council, more checks and balances, and the Guardian Council assures that any law that's being passed by the Majles is compatible and follows Islamic Sharia law. So let me give you an example. So in Iran, it is illegal to open a bar because under the Muslim faith, you're not allowed to drink. So let's say that the Majles pass a law that allows bars. The Guardian Council would shoot this down, saying that it isn't compatible with Sharia law. That's their role. There are 290 members of the Majles. They're elected on fixed terms of every 4 years, and these are separate from your presidential elections. Elections are partially multi-member districts and partially single-member districts. The Guardian Council is also important because they will filter candidates for office. So not everyone can run. Joe Schmo cannot run. Now, half of the Guardian Council is appointed by the Supreme Leader, and half is appointed by the head of the Judiciary, who is selected by the Supreme Leader. And the majors have a role in this because they will vote and approve of these appointments. So they're not going to initially select the members. That's the job of the head of the judiciary and the supreme leader. However, the majors will vote and say, okay, they're okay. They're Muslim enough. Essentially, that's what they're doing. Let's talk about Mexico now. So this consists of an elected lower house, which is the Chamber of Deputies, and they'll approve legislation, levy taxes, and verify the outcomes of elections and make sure they were free, fair, competitive, that sort of thing. Every vote counts. The cartels didn't intervene, that sort of thing. So these 500 members hold singular 3-year terms, makes them very accountable. The elected upper house, the Senate, holds the unique power to confirm presidential appointments to the Supreme Court. That's very important to know that this is something that the Senate can only do. So the upper house of Mexico can approve of these presidential appointments to the Supreme Court. They can also pass legislation, approve treaties, and approve federal intervention in state matters. So they could approve a federal military intervention to help drug cartels. Not help them, but to help stop drug cartels. Typically, our upper houses have fewer members. So in Mexico, there are 128 members in the upper house. 3 members are representing each state, plus some other districts like Mexico City. And they hold singular 6-year terms. Nigeria, very similar. They have an elected upper and lower house. They have a Senate, which is the upper house. And then they have a House of Representatives, not a Chamber of Deputies. Both chambers hold the power to approve legislation and hold the cabinet accountable for policy implementation. The Senate has the ability to impeach the president or other members of the government, as well as they have unique confirmation powers through various appointments. The Senate has 109 senators, and just like in Mexico, they represent the states, 3 each per state, and then 1 from a different region. The House of Representatives has 360 members, and only recently has the legislature been a check on executive power. As we talked about in Unit 1, Nigeria is a democratizing country, so it's going from an authoritarian to democratic regime, and it still has some authoritarian roots and plenty that they're trying to dissolve and kind of move away from. And this is a very recent and very current process. So any system of checks and balances between the legislature and executive branch are very new and contemporary in this country. All right, in Russia, they have an elected state Duma, which is the lower house. They'll pass legislation and confirm the prime minister who is appointed by the president. They serve to represent the voters, to represent the individual people of Russia. And 340 out of 450 seats are held by the United Russia Party, the dominant party of Russia. So are they really representing voters? Well, some could say they are. If 340 out of 450% of the people in Russia attach themselves to the United Russia Party or vote for the United Russia Party. Well, it's kind of a coincidence that there's not very many seats that are held by opposing viewpoints. Now we have a Federation Council, which is the upper house. They'll approve budget legislation, treaties, judicial nominees, and troop deployments. And just like in Nigeria and Mexico, this upper house represents the regions, except they have 2 members from each of the 89 federal regions. One is selected by the governor, and one is selected by the regional legislature. So they're not voted on by the people. So that means they're representing the regions and overall regional interests. And they can reject legislation from the state Duma. However, it doesn't really do anything because the Duma can override this and still pass the legislation. Now, there's something to note. The power of the decree. The power of decree. The president holds the power of decree. And what does this mean? Well, it means it can pass law and the legislator can't do anything about it. They don't have any input in this matter. It's kind of like executive orders in the United States. However, this is Russia. It's called power of decree. So if Putin wants to pass a law, he can. And the legislator can't do anything about it. They say no, Putin, just laugh at their face. I also have the United Kingdom's legislature. So it consists of 2 houses. It's bicameral. It has a House of Commons with 650 members, so it's the lower house, and they'll approve legislation and the prime minister who's appointed by the monarch. So I've said before that the parliament will appoint and select the prime minister in the United Kingdom because they don't have a president, and the people don't vote for the prime minister. And let me elaborate on this a little bit. So the monarch will appoint a prime minister, and the House of Commons will vote and approve of this prime minister, and they can say no. That can't happen. That is 100% a possibility. The monarch can't just override that. But the monarch and the House of Commons will agree essentially not prime minister. They may be recommended by the House of Commons too. There's a lot of say that goes into this process. And the House of Commons has expanded its power tremendously, particularly through two acts, the 1911 and 1949 Parliamentary Acts. And around this time, the monarch, which is the king or queen, has lost a considerable amount of its powers. It's essentially been transferred to the House of Commons and other parts of the political system. And then we also have a House of Lords, which is the upper house, which has 775 seats. And they review and amend bills from the Commons. They can't reject any bills that are passed by the House of Commons, but they can delay it for up to 2 years. So let's say the House of Commons passes a monetary policy. The House of Lords are going to say, no, we're not ready for this economic policy yet. Let's delay it for 2 years, and we'll be ready probably by then. They can do that, and that serves as a form of checks and balances between the two chambers. Now, they have considerably lower power. For one, they can't override legislation, and they can't pass legislation. It has to be brought up through the House of Commons. It's also the only hereditary house in the world today. Now, what does this mean, a hereditary house? It means some of the seats are inherited. It's not directly elected by the people, unlike the House of Commons, by thy people, by the people. So the hereditary peers are seats passed down through family, so they're inherited. And we have life peers, where the individual was appointed because of a lifelong service. So neither of these types of seats, are elected by the people. The House of Commons, though, is elected by the people. Okay, so we talked about the legislative systems for our core countries. Now let's talk about the idea of independent legislators. It is exactly how it sounds. The legislators have the ability to do their job correctly and efficiently, independently. And this is basically separation of powers. So there's very low fusion between the other branches. There may be fusion to some degree. This is only part of it. For the most part, there is some degree of separation of powers. There's checks and balances, particularly between the executive, legislative, and judicial. So judicial review can come into play, or the executive can veto a law. Now, the UK, Nigeria, and Mexico, for the most part, have independent legislators. I know the UK has a fused legislator between the executive and the legislative branch. However, it's not fused to the degree that the legislator is not independent. It's not a rubber stamp, as we would say, for China or Russia. These three countries, Iran, China, and Russia, do not have independent legislators for a variety of reasons. An independent legislator, for the most part, will respond to the needs of the people, their desires, what they want to happen in the country, what should happen within the country. They'll also produce compromises between political factions. So these could be your political parties. They share common unifications that bind them together and their beliefs. And also to promote civil liberties and extend them. They're not taking away anyone's right to live or life, liberty, property. Some would say the pursuit of happiness. Your basic civil liberties. They're trying to uphold them and enforce them. Now, something else to point out is that these independent legislators should run in a relatively predictable manner. So people who are electing these officials expect their officials to act in a certain way, act in those interests because they are representing the voters. In most cases, in the House of Lords, it doesn't really happen that way. And independent legislators, for the most part, will bolster legitimacy and stability because people will think they're running correctly. So let's talk about Russia, Nigeria, and Mexico. What's so similar about these three countries? I'll show you. They have presidential decree, which means that the president can pass law without the legislators' input. Now, legislators can just simply overturn them. No, they can't. Russia's legislator, for the most part, is a rubber stamp of the executive branch, so they have no reason to overturn them because they're just going to agree or be scared to disagree with the policy, as both branches are dominated by United Russia. Nigeria and Mexico have relatively free and fair elections for the legislature and executive branches, each with set election dates. Yeah. Now, China and the United Kingdom. We talked about how the NPC, according to the Constitution, is the true center of power. However, it's the entire Chinese Communist Party. Now we have the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the true seat of power. If you want a real organization, this is what you want to look at. The Politburo Standing Committee. They're the top leadership of the Communist Party, so they're a little portion of it. They'll assume legislative duties for 50 weeks out of the year when the NPC is not in session, so they're the true legislator. They'll even set the legislative agenda. and they'll supervise NPC member elections. So the NPC is just kind of a small little baby to them. They'll also, quote unquote, interpret laws and the Constitution. The Constitution that they don't really follow that well. And then in the UK, there's also some fusion here. There's fusion between the executive and legislative branches, and this leaves the legislature with fewer checks, but the Prime Minister can still veto legislation and call for new elections, and calling for new elections means that these candidates in the House of Commons have 30 days to campaign before a new election. So there are systems of checks and balances in place between these two branches. Let's talk about Iran. So we have the Guardian Council, which vets candidates and oversees the majlis to make sure laws comply with Islamic laws. We saw earlier, the system checks and balances, make sure the majlis are passing laws that uphold the Islamic faith. The Guardian Council can approve of these laws or they can veto them. There's also the Expediency Council, which is selected purely by the Supreme Leader. Remember, the Supreme Leader nominates half of the Guardian Council, but they select the entire Expediency Council. And they are an advisory committee that will resolve any disputes and create compromise between the majlis and the Guardian Council. So if they bicker back and forth, this Expedient Council will come in and settle all the heat and tension. And they are a check on the legislative and judicial branches. Now let's talk about... And they are a check on the legislative and judicial branches. Alright, let's talk about the judicial system. So, for the most part, judiciaries have similar functions. These functions include interpreting and applying laws, resolving disputes, typically in the form of lawsuits between two parties, uphold the rights and liberties of citizens, upholding their right to live, any rights and principles that are written within a constitution, provide a sound legal system and enforcing the laws within those legal systems and defining those laws and what they mean, and maintaining a separation of powers and having independence and doing their job correctly without influence and external control of other organizations or branches, and to establish and uphold the rule of law so nobody, even a presidential candidate or a prime minister, is above the law. Everyone has to follow the law and will be held to the same standards. Now, all judiciaries serve the same functions. No, not all of them do. For the most part, all of them should follow these 6 functions I just mentioned. But some, like in Iran, they have a job of upholding Islamic faith and Sharia law. So that's not going to happen in the United Kingdom, for example, because they're not a theocracy. So it can vary at a country-by-country basis. Let's talk about China. So, rule by law happens in China. This means that the judicial system is subservient to the Communist Party. So, the Communist Party is kind of above the law, and people who are not communists are below the law. The Communist Party will control most judicial appointments, so these ideologies are represented within the judicial system. And the courts must follow these party decisions, or they just won't be effective, or the judges will be replaced. The People's Procuratorate, I don't even know how to say that, provides public prosecutors and defenders to the courts. Again, communists, not Joe Smo can't just come in and do this. Oh, great, the Constitution. The Constitution states courts should exercise judicial power independently and free of interface from other bodies and organs and organizations. Constitution is such a joke in China because the Communist Party does not interfere with the court. They don't nominate the judicial appointments or anything. And it's not like the courts are just another body of the CCP like every other branch in China is. If you haven't taken that away from this course yet, there you go. Alright, let's talk about Iran. So the Iranian judiciary has a major function to ensure that the legal system follows the religious law and that judges are trained in Islamic Sharia law. This is considered secular law. So, for example, banks in Iran are forbidden to charge interest outside of free trade zones. This is called riba. The head of the judiciary is a cleric. They are appointed by the supreme leader, and they actually nominate half of the Guardian Council, but the majlis will approve of these nominations. There are also civil courts for some smaller crimes and revolutionary courts for more serious crimes, particularly national security trials. In Mexico, we have a judiciary that's in transition. The Supreme Court is the center of judicial review, and if judicial review warrants it, there will be constitutional amendments, and this will make the system more independent and effective. There are 11 magistrates that are nominated by the president, and the Senate will approve of these magistrates. So they have the appointment power. And then these judges, these magistrates, as the term for it, have a term of 15 years. Federal and state courts of origination appeals also exist for your smaller crimes in the appeals. And then the Supreme Court is that big court of appeals, the final court of appeals. In Nigeria, we have 21 Supreme Court judges. So in Mexico, there's 15. In Nigeria, there's 21. They're recommended by a judicial council. They're the only country that has a judicial council. And they are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So very similar to Mexico, as in they're confirmed by the Senate. The judiciary in Nigeria has the power of judicial review, and an effort has been made, because they're democratizing, to reestablish its legitimacy and independence, and they're trying to reduce corruption. Now, since Nigeria is a federal state, regional interests are upheld more in these regional governments, and northern Nigeria is particularly Muslim. So Islamic Sharia courts have been established in the north because of that Muslim occupation in the north. There's also a Federation Court of Appeals that will hear appeals from the state courts of origination and appeals. And the Supreme Court is obviously the highest court of appeals in Nigeria. So let's talk about Russia. Russia's government uses the judicial system to target opposition. Why am I not surprised? They'll target people who disagree with the government's decisions and united Russia as a whole. Constitutionally, the courts have had the power of judicial review. However, it's never been used. Ever. Judicial review has never been used by the judges to limit the authority of the government branches, particularly the legislative branch. So nothing's been deemed unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court was established in the 1993 Constitution. It has 19 members appointed by the President and confirmed by the Federation Council. So none of these members are elected by the people. It is important to note that the Federation Council, the upper house, confirms these appointments. But we do have district courts that deal with criminal trials. We have regional courts that are appellate courts. And we have a Supreme Court, which is the final court of appeals. And it's made up of 115 members that are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Federation Council. It's the last resort for Russian administrative, civil, and criminal law. In the United Kingdom, they have common law because they don't have a constitution that will enforce the rule of law, so nobody is above the law, and they use a variety of unwritten laws and principles based on legal precedents set by the courts, as well as some other legal documents like the Magna Carta. Top judges will use this common law system to interpret possibly very vague laws and establish a judicial precedent and legal precedent for other judges and organizations to follow. We're actually looking at an example shortly. So, a major function of the Supreme Court includes serving as the final court of appeals, protecting human civil rights and liberties, and ruling on devolution disputes, because the United Kingdom is big on its devolution and transferring power to its regional assemblies. The UK Supreme Court is also very new. It was established by an act of parliament in 2009, particularly to resolve disputes regarding regional authorities, aka devolution. So let's look at an example of a 2014 judgment, and it's revolving around the agriculture sector bill. So a little bit of history. Wales and England were under a system of regulating agriculture wages, so pay, until 2013. So they're under the same ideas of payment for their agriculture sector until 2013. And this was under the Agriculture Wages Act of 1948, and this was established by the Parliament until 2013 came along and wiped this system under the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act. Now, the Welsh Assembly, when this system was wiped, sought to create a new agriculture wages panel just for Wales, and they stated that they could do this because it was falling under Assembly competence to make legislation that relates to, and this is quoted, agriculture, horticulture, forestry, fisheries and fishing, animal health and welfare, plant health, plant varieties and seeds, and rural development. So these are powers that have been devolved to Wales by the overall federal United Kingdom government. And they said regulating agriculture wages within Wales falls under these categories. Now, the Attorney General of the UK disagreed and found that the issue didn't really revolve around agriculture, but employment and industrial relations themselves. So these powers should not be devolved to the Welsh Assembly, and they don't have the competency to make such decisions. However, the Supreme Court looked at the case and unanimously found, which means they all agreed, that the bill did fall within the competency of the Welsh Assembly, aka they had the power to make this wages panel. Also, independent judiciaries are the last topic for the unit. So it's very similar to independent legislators. So there are various factors that impact the judiciary's independence in our course country. So for one, the amount of authority the courts have to overrule executive and legislative actions. How much checks and balances are in place here, essentially? So do they have the power of judicial review? Can they find laws unconstitutional that can warrant constitutional amendments, like that can happen in Mexico. Overrule decisions. There's also the process by which judicial officials acquire their jobs. Are they acquiring their jobs from approval of the president and that's it? Or are they being confirmed by a body in the legislature? Or are they being acquired by a party? Also, the length of judicial terms. Shorter term limits means that they're going to be more accountable in their actions. They may not follow a certain agenda. They also could have professional and academic backgrounds that differ from what they should be practicing. Judicial officials are expected to have backgrounds in Iran. They need to have backgrounds in Islamic faith, but in other countries, they need to have overall background in the law, in the lawmaking processes, in the law enforcement processes of their countries. If they don't have these backgrounds, then the judiciaries really don't have much independence because they can't do their job correctly. And there's also processes to remove judges from their posts. So impeachment can happen. In Nigeria, the Senate can call for the impeachment of a justice. In some countries, like China, don't have impeachment processes. So they're not very independent in that case. So what's the functions of our independent judiciaries? Well, to maintain checks and balances, protect rights and civil liberties, establish the rule of law, maintain separation of powers, that's a big one, hold the government accountable for the actions. This is where judicial review and constitutional provisions comes hand in hand. Provide an access point to the legal system for citizens. Ensure free, fair, and contested elections. They can kind of call out an election. And they can follow the rules. Now, what can undermine independence and take it away? So, appointing very loyal judges who have a set agenda to follow, particularly if there's no term limits. Removing or threatening the removal of judges if they don't act in a certain way. Promising royalty for loyalty or bribes, blackmailing or intimidating judges. This is where drug cartels come into play. Refusing to implement or ignore judicial decisions. So if there's a precedent set in the United Kingdom and the judges just ignore it, that's undermining their independence dramatically. They could also limit, if the court's power or jurisdiction is limited, that's going to undermine their independence if they don't have the ability to execute their job correctly. As well as allowing direct intervention by the executive or the police, or if the president says no, or they remove a judge halfway through a case, that's going to undermine the independence. There's no checks and balances or separation of powers in that case. Controlling legal education or professional association. So if these judges who are being educated in law are educated in a certain way, that can undermine the independence because they're being educated in a biased way. There's also ruling by decree or referendum. So decrees can be the president passes a law after the judges make a decision, and it overrides their decision. And well, what the heck did that just do then? Okay, so let's look at our course countries now, because we've done that a lot. So we're going to do it again. Starting with the United Kingdom. So the judicial branch of the United Kingdom is viewed as independent from partisan influence and from control of the legislative and executive branches. So we see proper separation of powers between the judicial branch and the other branches. Now, the United Kingdom is kind of special because I've mentioned earlier that there's no judicial review, but there sort of is, sort of isn't. So we'll explain that. So they allow for rule of law and a degree of judicial checks and balances without a written constitution and no judicial review. What this essentially means is that they don't have a constitution to base it off of, no written paper, and they don't have the process to say that there's anything that's unconstitutional because there's no constitution. So they have to use the prior legal precedents and common law to determine if an action was lawful and necessary or not. It may not be. So in 2019, for example, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the Prime Minister's suspension of Parliament was unlawful, and he suspended Parliament to withdraw the state from the European Union. And they said, you can't do that for that reason. You can suspend Parliament with the proper reason, but this was not the proper reason to do so. So this is actually an example of checks and balances on the executive branch. And sometimes they can use it on the legislative branch. Sometimes the Supreme Court will rule over civil matters as well. It's still a very new system, so there's not too many examples that we can give, at least too many understandable and completed examples. So in Mexico, they have a improved judiciary with improved independence, particularly in their judicial review, which can cause for constitutional provisions. But they do see pressures from organized crime that threaten for their own independence. Particularly, this is the drug cartels that threaten for their own autonomy and their own rule. The president can recommend justices that are confirmed by the Senate for 15 your term. So this kind of weeds out any justices, weeds out those that are not on an agenda. However, if the government has a set agenda in place, they may only approve justices that follow their beliefs and ideologies. But they do have the power of judicial review and can say that certain laws are unconstitutional. In Nigeria, they also have judicial review, and the judiciary has also tried to improve its independence, and this is particularly through reducing corruption. This is a very, very recent and concurrent process. They use a common law legal system as well as their constitution, and this common law legal system is notable because they'll give more power to the judges to interpret the meaning of laws. They have to set the precedents to have them, and that's essentially what they're doing right now. But they do process judicial review to call certain laws unconstitutional. And then in the 2019 presidential elections prior to it, the president suspended the chief justice. Now, what does this mean? This is a lack of judicial independence because we see a fusion between executive and judicial power. We actually see a diminishing judicial power here, and an indicator of reversing independence or democratization. The Supreme Court justices are also recommended by a judicial council and are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, which is 3 whole steps, which is a lot. It can be a lot of obstacles for a candidate to become a justice. In Iran, they have a constitution that claims the judiciary is an independent power, but the courts are commonly used to prosecute opposition figures, particularly those that oppose the government or Islamic law. This can create a culture of rule by law as contrasted to rule of law, which is in an independent judiciary typically found in a democratic society. They're holding the opposition to a higher standard, essentially, in the sense that if they do something, they're going to face a higher punishment or a more direct punishment. But they do have judicial review, so if a law is considered not Muslim, they will call that out, sort of like the Guardian Council. The ultimate legal authority doesn't really rest in the Constitution, but in Islamic law, and this cannot be overruled. And overall, it treats men and women, and Muslims and non-Muslims unequally. For example, they'll fail to protect certain civil liberties and rights that we have in America and other countries, such as the death penalty for homosexuality, alcoholism, etc. In China, there is no independence of courts, even though judges sometimes make rulings against the government in lawsuits by citizens. This is very rare. But the courts are essentially just communist figures. These rulings against the government are seen as superficial, and they do not have the power of judicial review, even the further constitution that really doesn't do anything. The Communist Party is the true center of power, and they also control judicial appointments that will follow their agenda. There's rule by law, so essentially people are above the law, and there's also a 99.3% conviction rate, as there's no protection of civil rights and liberties. So if you do something, you're probably going to jail. You're not going to pass go. You're not going to collect $200. Even if you didn't do something, you could still go to jail. That's just how it works. And finally, Russia, they have a judiciary that's not independent because the government has used the courts in the targeting of political opponents and dissidents, particularly during election time. Now, they've never used its power to check the president's power or the legislator. They've never used judicial review. It does exist, but they don't use it. They've never used it. The president, which is part of United Russia that controls the majority of Congress, appoints and approves those who sit on the federal judiciary, so lack of independence there. Judicial review exists, but it hasn't been practiced. Yeah, just doesn't exist. All right, let's review our topics from this unit. We went through a lot. So we went through parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems. We went through the executive and legislative and judicial branches. We went over executive term limits and the removal of the executives. We also went through legislative and judicial independence and a great analysis of checks and balances and separation of powers. Remember, there are practice tests in the description down below. Go check those out for multiple choice and FRQs and answer keys and review explanation videos. They're very cool. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Go check out the next unit or go back and watch some of the unit videos or the multiple choice review video. Those are pretty cool as well. Please subscribe, like the video. It really does help me out, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.